So dead life falls to the bottom of a riverbed, settles in the mud. Sand and silt slowly gather above, and time passes, sediment presses. Under pressure, once live substance waits. Millennium tick. Then, in 1860, oil, so long in the sediment, is pulled into activity by North America's first commercial oil well in Oil Springs, Ontario, Canada. Oil gushed higher than the treetops, slathering the workers and the land, turning the Black Creek black, running into the Sediment River, which then empties nearby into the St. Clair River. So, we've got a pointer, but this part is the St. Clair River. This is St. Clair Lake. This is a little bit called the Detroit River. This is Lake Erie, and above is Lake Huron. So here is another bigger thing. Here's the Great Lakes. Canada up here. US down here. But this is South Canadian, right? This is the little bit that I'm looking at. So St. Clair River, the lake, Detroit River. This is Detroit. And you can see it's really a borderland between the two, as well as having several First Nations territories. Okay, so the St. Clair River forms a natural passage from Lake Huron through Lake Erie. They cut this border, the west US, the east Canada. Today, the St. Clair is a deep water channel connected to inland shipping laneways, which then lead out to the Atlantic Ocean, as well as to railroads and highways that spread across continental North America. So what began with one oil well and a short pipeline to the nearby town of Petrolia is today's Chemical Valley. That's its actual name, where 40% of the country's petrochemical processing is accomplished. And those of you, I mean, I know that the Keystone Pipeline has been a big deal here, so maybe people here have become more aware that Canada is a petrochemical and extraction nation. So Chemical Valley, which sits below the city of Sarnia, Ontario, and across the river from Port Huron, Michigan, first expanded beyond oil with a polymer rubber processing plant. Dow Chemical opened the plant in 1942 as part of the Canadian War effort, and it graces the back of our 1971 Canadian $10 bill. Plants is the symbolic origin point of a national industrial history. And today, this polymer plant is joined by over 60 other refining plants. Oil now pulses through the Enbridge's transcontinental 2,306-kilometer pipeline from the Alberta tar sands to Sarnia. So, again, up here's Alberta. You can see Edmonton above is where the tar sands are, which I'm sure you've all heard now of, which is about the size of the state of Florida. And then you can see the pipeline coming down here to Sarnia. Another, you can notice this little gray pipeline. This is actually expanding. This is where the fracked natural gas is now being brought up to Sarnia. So it's an important node in the transcontinental pipeline infrastructure. So there's this web of pipelines, right, which leads all around the United States, and there's also a matrix of local pipelines that connect one chemical or oil processing refinery to another. So the whole kind of town is interconnected in pipelines. Down the St. Clair and onto the Detroit River, the waterway runs past Chemical Valley. That is both the home to commercial oil and the Ford Motor Company. So really this site, you can get a sense of this waterway, this industrial corridor, we're going down the river. It connects oil to cars. The cars themselves are made there. Steel is forged to make the cars, the rubber refined, but so too, this is an important site for the making of styrene, chlorine, polychloroethylene, which is what you use for dry cleaning, as well as plastics that have made the commercial products of our life. So petrochemicals in Chemical Valley have really been something that reconfigures life. So starting with the petrochemical history of the St. Clair River, what this project and this paper tries to do is to think about assisted reproduction or undistributed reproduction, chemicals, and time. So I think like many authors here, I'm thinking what counts as reproduction, what counts as life, where does biological reproduction reside? Of course, in bodies, or in fetuses, in wombs, in genitals, in sperms, in eggs, in kinships, in heteronormative futures, in coercial racial policies, etc. I think there's like tectonic forces that conspire to offer up bodies as this answer. And what I think many of us are asking is, does reproduction stop there? Right? And here we're, going back to Donna Haraway 25 years ago, and her question, why should our bodies end at our skin? Right? Offering us that figure of the cyborg. At that moment, feminists were resisting a politics that posited bodies as natural entities, and instead insisting that any version of nature biology at the end of the 20th century was already conditioned by technoscience. And to this, I want to add that any reference to nature or biology in the 21st century is already conditioned by the chemical distributions of industrialism. Thus, in a similar spirit, one might pose the question, why should reproduction end in our bodies? How can we participate in the ontological politics of what counts as reproduction? And what is the place of industrial chemicals in reproduction? And here, of course, is all this wonderful feminist STS work on the question of assisted reproduction, with the help of many of the work of people in this room. We've come to think of reproduction as a social, an embodied, a technical achievement in which matrices of labor, a multitude of actors, legal regimes, all come together to make reproduction possible. And in this work, I think one of the emphases has been on reproduction as a site of animation, of recombinatory logics, of manipulation, of the responsive capacities of micrological life that gets harnessed by biocapitalism, by bio-labor, by nation states, etc. So reproduction, I think, we've tended as a field in feminist science studies to emphasize it as a generative and promissory domain of life and economic value. And so I'm interested in maybe attending a little bit like Kara's work, I think, into the places of devaluation or unvaluation in this process of life limited. In asking the question of how can we even go farther with assisted reproduction, include extensive infrastructures, biomedical, military, chemical, ecological, agriculture, to John on Susan, architecturals, all these things that assist, that alter, that rearrange, that participate in creating and maintaining life in intergenerational time. So what are these kind of topographies? What do we need to be doing? I think that's what a lot of the people in the room are doing, but the different kind of conceptual frameworks. So I want to pose then the question of assisted reproduction in terms of distributed reproduction, particularly uneven distribution. So to propose reproduction as a question of uneven spatial and temporal distributions, that is infrastructural, and then ask questions about what aspects of life are assisted and what abandoned, what is reproduced through what infrastructures and what averted, what purposely persists and what is unintentionally altered. And then moreover, for this paper, I want to think about not just the way that all these infrastructures help life move forward or be generative, but to think about temporal questions of latency, of not moving, of killability, of not living in chemical infrastructures of reproduction. So by chemical infrastructures, I mean spatially and temporal distributions of industrially produced chemicals as they are produced, consumed, made mobile in the atmosphere, settled into landscapes, traveled in waterways, leached from commodities, are regulated, or not, mostly, by states, monitored by experts, engineered, absorbed by bodies, metabolized, here to think about Hannah's work, bioaccumulate in chains, break down over time, or assist. So I'm thinking about chemical infrastructures as a way of trying to name these pathways and processes of how industrial chemicals are structuring life, human and non-human. And importantly, chemical infrastructures are translocal, they're transnational, they connect production, consumption, they move across borders, they traverse scales of life. They are temporally distributed, that means they're distributed in time. Some break down quickly, others persist. Some are present for really long durays, others cause immediate responses in organisms. Others only provoke effects that we see generations from now. Some are a kind of slow injury, a kind of slow violence. Some have effects at planetary scale. So the question of time and scale, I think, is something to really think about. So it is this temporal aspect of chemical infrastructures that I'm going to try to quickly, I've lost a little bit of my time, get into by thinking a bit about reproductive toxins and endocrine disruptors in this particular river. And the question of latency. So latency is the period of time between stimulus and response, the gap between one event and another. In medicine, latency time is similar to an incubation period. It's the time between infection and infectiousness. It is the wait between a chemical exposure and its felt symptom. So to be latent is to be dormant. It is to be a potential not yet manifest. In temporal terms, latency names the wait for the effects of the past to arrive in the present. So as such, latency is the movement from past to present or even to future. It's the inverse of the temporal orientation of anticipation, which structures so much of our thinking. Latency in ecological time names how the submerged sediments of the past arrive in the present to disrupt the reproduction of the same. So through latency, the future is already altered. So latency, I want to argue here, is useful for thinking about these chemical infrastructures that are at stake in the St. Clair River area. As the site of a chemical infrastructure, this river is not only a crucial node in the perpetuation of a petrochemical network, it is also a landscape saturated with the affluent of industrialism. Since the 1950s, through layers of industrial processes, the excess of production have been moved into the waters, airs, and grounds in the region. At least since the 1950s, chemical dumping into the St. Clair has been a source of public anxiety and scientific study. In the 70s, in the wake of Lovetown, which isn't too far from here, so too is the storage of industrial sludge underground, an important question. And here, this area has a particular geological understrata of salt deposits that then create natural salt caverns that become natural places to put your toxic sludge. Under the Earth's surface, 73 caverns on the Canadian side, you can see those dots and squares for some of them. On the Canadian side, each of these caverns hold the equivalent of 3 large above-ground petroleum tanks. So it's not just the river, but under the ground is a whole world of this excess. Worry, too, has bubbled in terms of the famous great algae blooms that strangle Lake Erie and have made it a dead lake, an oxygen-depleted lake. In 1969, the oil slick on the Cayuga River, another famous thing, which just is above where it pours into Lake Erie, not far from this. This river is very similar to the one I'm studying. It was considered the most polluted in the United States. It caught fire in a location just before it pours into Lake Erie. Here's what, in 1969, it was like your hand in the Cayuga. Anxiety, therefore, was accumulated in this period about the way that chemical alterations of the waterway had become highly visible. And as an effect, has prompted the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement of '72, strengthened in '78. The result was the pushing of fluid skyward, instead of into the water, through stacks, into the air. Yet even in the 1980s, the past came back. In '85, a toxic sludge congealment named the Sarnia blob, like a B movie, as big as a basketball court, appeared in the St. Clair River, following the leakage of liquid industrial waste from a cavern operated by Dow Chemical. The blob was triggered by a leak of 2,500 gallons of perchloroethylene into the river, which then congealed with chemicals from previous spills to form a sludge of arsenic, copper, cadmium, chromium, iron, lead, mercury, nickel, zinc, polychlorinated biphenyls, hexachlorobenzene, phosphorus, chromium, iron, lead, mercury, manganese, oil, grease, and a cocktail of at least 30 toxic compounds known as polyaromatic hydrocarbons. Dow was fined $16,000 for this spill and spent another $1 million vacuuming it up. Maxwell Cohen, chairman of the International Joint Commission that revised the Water Quality Agreement in '78, described the latent presence of toxic chemicals in this area as, quote, the revenge of the industrial past on the chemical present. So in the contemporary, river and lake sediment have become a contested site that materially archives this chemical past. To remove the sediment, it's to disturb it and hence to release the toxic residues back into animation. Yet the river and the lake floors are not frozen in time. They continue to move and flow. They're dredged because it is a deep water channel. PCBs, though banned in the 1980s, continue to persist in the St. Clair River and across Lake Erie with intensive accumulations along the shores and canals of the river. As a deep water shipping channel, right, this area is always in movement, and the chemical archive refuses to be set just remain latent. So this is a figure of PCBs in Lake Erie. This is where the Detroit River pours out. So you can see the concentrations always where Lake St. Clair and the Detroit River pour into it. Here's another one. And what's so interesting about these things is, of course, you either get the American data or the Canadian data, right? You never get the full picture. So this is dots about PCB concentration. As you can see here, the red is equal to or greater than 100 times the level at which you have effects. So between 10 and 100 times that level, and the purple is greater than 100 times that level where you have effects in life. And this is the river here. And you can see that's where the purple and red are. Here's another example of attempt to another kind of work looking at PCBs. This is turtle eggs, and this is the concentration here. The St. Clair River is again not far from river, which is another interesting spot. Okay. Squeezed between Seneca and Shell, the Aamjiwnaang First Nation is a small Ojibwe group whose ancestors have long lived along the St. Clair, and as a colonized people, the Aamjiwnaang First Nation, referred into Canadian government documents by the bureaucratic name Sarnia in 1845, lays sovereign claim to a small territory of some hectares wedged amidst these refineries. They're wedged between Imperial Oil, Seneca, Shell, and the old polymer plant. In recent years, the environmental activists, justice activists at the First Nation have worked with some local doctors, scientists, a couple lawyers, to document the first known case of dramatic reduction in birth ratio of boys to girls not associated with an acute industrial and nuclear accident. So from 1999 to 2003, only 35 boys are born out of 100 children instead of a regular ratio of like 51 to 41. So this site and community sits at the crosshairs of multiple scales of governmentality. Also, as the U.S.'s largest supplier of oil, Canada remains deeply invested in spatializing unregulated regions for its production and refinement. Thus, what is known about the chemical infrastructures of Chemical Valley comes less from the state and state-sponsored research than Aamjiwnaang environmental activists, local NGOs, and freshwater ecologists. So here's a map by a local NGO of all the refineries. You can see the green is Aamjiwnaang First Nation. Here's some of the work they've done. Of course, they've done bucket brigades to do air sampling, community body health maps to try to document what's happening in the community. But these efforts really can only show a snapshot of a moment in time when a chemical exposure takes place in terms of bucket sampling, or community health effects later, for which you don't know the cause. So there's always this temporal gap in the kinds of knowledge you can make. And so environmental justice activists have learned the painful lesson that chemical injury is not just displaced spatially, with superstacks, toxic trading, colonialism, etc., but also chemical injury is displaced temporally, such that accountability exceeds the scope of individual life, bioaccumulate or persist over time and across regulatory regimes into the long durée. And in particular, one of the things I'm looking at, I realize I'm running out of time, is the fact that reproductive toxins are understood to have effects on the development of the next generation of life. So they can affect the eggs inside the body, or if you're pregnant, the eggs developing inside of a fetus. So the effects are felt at the grandchild level. So the question of multi-generational slow violence is a really material and important question that connects to indigenous work thinking about multi-generational colonial violence. Since I'm basically out of time, I'll say that an important place of work here is the work of freshwater ecologists who use animals and the ecosystem as a way to assay the existence of reproductive toxin that the state and the industry is refused to acknowledge there. So to conclude, from the capacity to proliferate in cell biology to the multi-generational reproduction of communities to the persistence of sediments into the future, chemical infrastructures of reproduction are shaped by time and latency. An assay used for a local fish, bucket sample, etc. shows an immediate exposure. A community health chart or sex ratio change can show a bodily effect of a past event. There's this important gap. Sediment holds past unregulated contaminants, releasable into the present. Latency, however, is not only a problem. It can become a source of interruption into the repetition of the same, for good or ill. Right? So chemical infrastructures of reproduction do not just make reproduction possible, they distribute reproduction in uneven and specific ways across both space and time. If in studying reproduction and participating in its politics, one aims to not just reproduce the same, not just to give in to the breathless futurism of contemporary anticipatory impulses, then how might our attention to the responsiveness to the past, or to the responsive generativity of life, be interrupted and supplemented and reoriented by thinking about time, latency, and the past? There is a politics to latency. Neither generativity, nor difference, nor the past, nor weight are in themselves ethical. Right? These are the things that instead we have to figure out the politics of. So really my question is, if reproduction is distributed, what are we waiting for? Thanks.